So, are you feeling strong enough to handle all this muscle information flying at you today? I knew you were. There are not one, not two, but 3 different types of muscle: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. This lecture will focus on general properties of muscles and then skeletal muscle. We will save the other 2 muscle types for another fun-filled presentation. Up first, some general properties of all muscle types. First, muscles are excitable. This doesn't mean that they jump up and down and can't control themselves every time they see you like a puppy, but rather that they respond to changes in electrical states. Muscles are also extensible and elastic. Extensible refers to their ability to stretch without ripping in half. Elastic refers to their ability to then return or recoil to their resting length after being stretched. Kind of like a balloon. You can stretch it out by filling it with air, but it will return to its original shape and size once you let the air out. Finally, muscles are contractile. This means that muscles can contract and shorten while generating force. This force is often used to generate movement, but not always. The shortening occurs when a special protein called myosin pulls on another special protein called actin. Now that we know a bit about muscles in general, let's start our exploration of the most common type of muscle, skeletal muscle. In fact, skeletal muscle is what most people refer to when they talk about muscles. Poor cardiac and smooth, it's all about skeletal. In fact, the human body contains around 700 skeletal muscles in a variety of shapes and sizes. No wonder the skeletal muscles account for almost half of our body weight. Before we get much further, we need to discuss some new terms. Skeletal muscles have both an insertion and an origin. The origin is generally the more fixed end of the muscle, while the insertion is the more movable end. The origin is also typically proximal to the insertion when the body is in anatomical position. Skeletal muscles can work alone or together to generate force and movement. When they work together, different muscles can play different roles, particularly in complex movements like lifting a glass to take a drink of water. The prime mover is the main muscle responsible for generating force for the movement. It is also known as the agonist. A synergist is a muscle that helps the agonist or prime mover with the movement. It's your helper muscle. It might add that little bit of extra oomph needed to get the job done. A fixator is a special kind of synergist that also helps, but rather than adding extra force in the same direction, it limits undesirable or unnecessary movements in other areas. Fixators usually accomplish this by stabilizing the bone where the prime mover attaches. Finally, the muscle that produces the opposite movement of the agonist or prime mover is called the antagonist. Just like in literature, the antagonist opposes the agonist. Who knew anatomy and literature overlap so much? Huh. Now, let's put all of this information to work in our drinking a glass of water example. To lift the glass, we need to flex the elbow. The biceps brachii would be the prime mover or agonist. The brachialis and brachioradialis muscles help with the same motion and would be the synergists. Not pictured, the serratus anterior helps stabilize the scapula to minimize unwanted movement as the fixator. And the triceps brachii does the opposite movement of elbow extension as the antagonist. Ta-da! Skeletal muscle interaction in action. Each skeletal muscle fiber is encased in a connective tissue lining known as the endomysium. Bundles of muscle fibers known as fascicles are encased in a perimysium, and the entire muscle is covered by the epimysium. The arrangement or direction of these muscle fascicles is related to the force it can generate as well as how much the muscle can stretch and contract or its range of motion. There are several common fascicle patterns in skeletal muscle as shown here. Parallel muscle fascicles are arranged, you guessed it, in parallel. This is the most common fascicle arrangement. If the muscle is parallel but plump in the middle with a large belly, we call it a fusiform muscle. Some fascicles are arranged in a circle as circular muscles. These are also called sphincters. Contraction of these muscles narrows an opening. Muscles which start out widespread with fascicles that converge at one point are called convergent muscles. Pinnate muscles blend into a common tendon like the feathers on a quill. In a unipinnate muscle, all fascicles are on one side of the tendon. In a bipinnate muscle, fascicles are on both sides. Finally, multipinnate muscles have multiple rows of fascicles and can even have multiple tendons that branch off the common tendon. Don't muscle fascicles come in a fantastic variety of patterns? So pretty. But regardless of the pattern, muscles generate the force to pull on the bones or levers across the joints or fulcrums to create movement. Back in the day, anatomists were charged with naming all 700 of the skeletal muscles. Many of those names help describe the muscle in some way. For example, names that include terms like maximus, medius, or minimus imply a large, medium, or small muscle, respectively. Similarly, longus and brevis muscles imply that the muscle is long and brief or short. Some names like lateralis and medialis refer to position, and others refer to fiber direction like rectus or straight and oblique or slanted. Finally, some muscles were named to reflect their actions like flexor, extensor, abductor, and adductor. We know that skeletal muscle can create movement, but have you thought about the fact that they both start and stop movement? They do, and thank goodness. Otherwise, we would all be running into walls and furniture and other people once we got going. Watch out, run away, human! Skeletal muscle also helps us maintain posture against gravity and maintain balance. Finally, skeletal muscle also plays a large role in maintaining homeostasis of body temperature by generating heat as a byproduct of contraction. That's why we shiver to warm up. Involuntary skeletal muscle contraction to generate heat and prevent hypothermia. Brilliant! We are now going to take a closer look at skeletal muscle on a cellular level. Muscle cells are also known as muscle fibers. They are striated or striped in appearance due to the banding patterns of actin and myosin. They are under voluntary control, and they are multinucleate due to the fusion of many muscle cells in utero. The cell parts of a skeletal muscle also have special names. The cell membrane is the sarcolemma, the cytoplasm is the sarcoplasm, and the endoplasmic reticulum is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I bet you figured out that sarco means muscle. The sarcomere is the functional or contractile unit of a muscle. It is made up of those alternating bands of actin or thin filament and myosin or thick filament. I remember that actin is the thin filament because it's a thinner word than myosin, which is the thick filament. Troponin and tropomyosin are regulatory proteins we will discuss in more detail next. The neuromuscular junction is also a special name for where a motor neuron or nerve meets a muscle cell. So we know skeletal muscles contract to generate force and movement, but how? It all starts with an action potential from the motor neuron at the neuromuscular junction. This excitatory electrical signal causes the neurotransmitter acetylcholine to be released from the motor neuron. The muscle cell receives the acetylcholine, which makes it open voltage-gated sodium channels, which generate another action potential in the sarcolemma. This then causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release stored calcium ions. The presence of calcium allows our regulatory protein troponin to pull on the other regulatory protein tropomyosin, which exposes actin's binding site on myosin. Get it? Troponin and tropomyosin are regulatory proteins because they regulate whether or not actin and myosin can bind by controlling the binding site. Once cleared to bind, ATP, or energy, rotates or cocks the myosin head to pull on the now bound actin and slide the two filaments past each other. Of note, ATP can be taken or created from different sources. Creatine phosphate stored in muscles can provide enough ATP for about 15 seconds of activity. Since that doesn't help with longer activities, anaerobic glycolysis can create ATP to sustain about 1 minute of activity. Anaerobic glycolysis is slower than creatine phosphate, but faster than aerobic respiration. It can make 2 ATPs from each molecule of glucose, but it also puts off lactic acid as a byproduct, which may lead to muscle fatigue. For longer activities and with the presence of oxygen, aerobic respiration is used to make about 36 ATP from that same glucose molecule. Obviously, the most efficient form of ATP manufacturing, this method accounts for about 95% of all ATP generated for muscle contraction. However, it is slow compared to the other two forms and is most useful in sustained, moderate to minimal activities and at rest. Because the two filaments actin and myosin slide past each other, we call this phenomenon the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. Actin and myosin slide past each other to shorten the muscle. When this happens at the same time along many sarcomeres in a long chain, the entire muscle can actually shorten quite a bit. Most of us don't go around with our muscles continually contracting. In fact, if they were, we wouldn't be able to move at all. In order for a muscle to relax and stop contracting, several things have to occur. First, the motor neuron stops firing and the release of acetylcholine ceases. This causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum gates to close and the release of calcium to stop. Calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to be stored for the next muscle contraction, and the absence of calcium causes the actin binding sites on myosin to be hidden once again. Relaxation. Muscle tension can be defined as the force generated by a muscle. The amount of force generated is related to the number of motor units recruited. A motor unit is one motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it innervates or excites. You can have very small motor units for increased control of movement or very large motor units for less control but more force. Motor units are also recruited asynchronously or in a different order each time the muscle contracts to help combat fatigue. The length tension curve pictured here also tells us about muscle tension. It demonstrates that optimal muscle force is generated when the muscle is at 80 to 120% of its resting length or slightly stretched. This directly correlates with the number of overlapping actin and myosin binding sites. In plain words, a slightly stretched muscle will generate more force. And now for our anatomical analogy. To what shall I compare the length tension curve? Shall I compare it to a paper plate or a plastic cup? No. The length tension curve is like a rubber band. Without any stretch, the rubber band generates no tension or force and just sits lamely on your desk. However, with a little bit of stretch, it comes to life and can fly across the room. But beware, too much stretch and the rubber band will break and pop you right in the face. A bit of stretch on a muscle generates more tension and force, within limits. We know that muscle tension is the force generated by a muscle to make it contract. However, did you know there are different types of muscle contraction? In isotonic muscle contractions, the muscle generates force and the load moves. Lifting the skeleton arm is an example of an isotonic contraction. However, isotonic contractions can be further subdivided into concentric and eccentric contractions. With a concentric isotonic contraction, the muscle shortens as it is generating force. With an eccentric isotonic contraction, the muscle lengthens as it's generating force. I find it easier to think about movement in relation to gravity when trying to decide between concentric and eccentric contractions. Concentric contractions move a load against gravity, while eccentric contractions control the load moving with gravity. For example, lifting the skeleton arm up is a concentric contraction of the biceps brachii because the arm is moving against gravity or away from the ground. When I lower the skeleton arm, it is an eccentric contraction of the biceps brachii because I am lowering it in a controlled fashion with gravity or toward the ground. If that helps, great. If not, sorry. Isometric contractions are much simpler. In an isometric contraction, the muscle generates force, but the load does not move. It's like if I were trying to push over a cow or through a wall. My muscle force is insufficient to move the load, but my muscles are still generating force. Try it sometime and see for yourself. To finish this lecture, we need to discuss muscle fiber types. Muscle fibers can be classified by their contraction speed and how they produce energy, or ATP. Type 1 fibers are also known as slow oxidative, or SO fibers. As their name implies, they contract relatively slow compared to fast fibers and use aerobic respiration to make ATP. These fibers are great for sustained long-term activities like walking and postural muscles. Type 2A fibers are also known as fast oxidative fibers. As their name implies, they contract faster than type 1 or slow oxidative fibers and also use oxygen for aerobic respiration to make ATP. However, these fibers can also switch over to anaerobic respiration or glycolysis. Sometimes type 2A fibers are called intermediate fibers because they are in between slow and fast twitch, or type 1 and type 2B fibers. Type 2B fibers are the fast glycolytic fibers. These fibers are fast, really fast, and use anaerobic glycolysis to make ATP. These fibers fatigue more quickly though, but are great for short, rapid, forceful movements like jumping and sprinting. Well, that does it for muscle purposes and skeletal muscle. See you next time.